Thomas had been walking for 3 days straight, and his boots were starting to fall apart. The leather was cracked, the soles were thin, and every step on the rocky Montana trail sent a sharp pain up his leg. But he kept walking anyway. What else was he going to do? It was October 8 in 87, and the morning air was so cold he could see his breath. The sun was just coming up over the mountains, painting the sky orange and pink. Most people would have thought it was beautiful. Thomas barely noticed. He'd been walking these empty roads for 3 years now, and one sunrise looked pretty much like another. His stomach growled. Again. He'd eaten the last of his bread yesterday, and the only thing left in his leather bag was a dented tin cup and a few coins that wouldn't buy much of anything. He'd have to find work soon, or he'd be begging for food again. The thought made him feel sick. Thomas wasn't always like this. 3 years ago, he had a job working on the railroad. It was hard work, but it paid well, and he was good at it. He could lay track faster than most men, and he knew how to fix the engines when they broke down. The other workers respected him. His bosses liked him. For a while, it seemed like he was finally getting his life together. But then the drinking started dotted. Began small. Just a sip of whiskey after work to help him sleep. Then a drink before work to steady his nerves. Then drinks during lunch break. Before long, he was showing up to work drunk, making mistakes, getting into fights with the other workers. His hands would shake when he tried to work, and he couldn't think straight. One morning, his boss found him passed out next to the tracks, still holding an empty bottle. That was it. They fired him on the spot. No second chances. No warnings. Just pack your things and get out. Thomas tried to write to his family back in Ohio, but what could he say? That he'd ruined everything again? That he was a failure? His brother had already told him never to come home after the last time. His parents were dead, and his sister wouldn't even read his letters anymore. He was completely alone, so he started walking. At first, he told himself he was looking for work. He'd go from town to town, asking if anyone needed help. Sometimes he'd get a day or two of work chopping wood or cleaning stables. Most of the time, people took one look at him and said no. He didn't blame them. His clothes were dirty. He hadn't shaved in weeks, and he probably smelled bad. After a while, he stopped looking for real work. He'd do odd jobs here and there, just enough to buy food and maybe a bottle of cheap whiskey. He slept outside most nights, under bridges or in abandoned barns. In the winter, he'd find shelter wherever he could. Sometimes kind people would give him a meal or let him sleep in their barn, but he never stayed long. He couldn't stand the way they looked at him, like he was some kind of wounded animal. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold or even the loneliness. The worst part was waking up every morning and having nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one waiting for him. No reason to get up except that lying there felt even worse than walking. Thomas had always been a man who needed purpose. Even as a kid, he was the one who organized games with the other children, who helped his father fix things around the house, who dreamed of building something important. But now, at 32 years old, he felt like he was just taking up space in the world. He'd been walking since before dawn, and the sun was getting higher. His throat was dry, and he was starting to feel dizzy. There was supposed to be a stream somewhere along this trail, but he hadn't found it yet. The landscape around him was beautiful in a harsh way. Rolling hills covered in brown grass, mountains in the distance, big sky that seemed to go on forever. But it all felt empty to him, like he was the only person left in the world. Thomas had been on this particular trail for 2 days now. It ran between Helena and Butte, 2 mining towns that were supposed to be booming. He'd heard there might be work there, but he wasn't hopeful. He'd heard that story before in other towns. By the time he got there, he'd probably find out all the jobs were taken, or that they only hired men with experience, or that they didn't want someone who looked like a drifter. The trail was rough and rocky, with deep ruts from wagon wheels. It wound through hills and valleys, following the path of least resistance. Thomas had been walking it slowly, stopping often to rest. His body wasn't as strong as it used to be. 3 years of poor eating and hard living had taken their toll. As he walked, his mind wandered to the same dark places it always did. What was the point of any of this? What was he hoping to find? He had no skills that anyone wanted, no family who cared about him, no dreams left to chase. He was just a broken man walking empty roads, getting older and more tired every day. Sometimes he thought about just lying down and not getting up again. It would be easier than this endless walking, this constant hunger, this feeling of being completely lost. But something always made him keep going. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was just habit. The sun was getting warmer now, and Thomas could feel sweat under his old coat. The coat was too big for him now. He'd lost weight over the past few months, and his clothes hung loose on his frame. His face was thin and weathered, with lines around his eyes from squinting in the sun. His dark hair was getting long and shaggy, and his beard was unkempt. He looked like what he was, a man who'd given up on himself. Thomas was thinking about stopping to rest when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a sound that didn't belong in this empty wilderness, a sound that made his heart start beating faster. It was the sound of wood breaking, splintering, crashing. And then, cutting through the morning air like a knife, came the sound of a woman crying, not just crying, sobbing. The kind of desperate, heartbroken sound that made Thomas forget about his own problems for the first time in years. Without thinking, he started running toward the sound, his worn boots slipping on the loose rocks. The sound was coming from around a bend in the trail, just ahead. Thomas ran faster than he'd run in months, his bag bouncing against his side, his breath coming in short gasps. As he rounded the bend, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, scattered across the trail like broken toys, were the remains of a covered wagon. The wooden wheels were cracked and broken. Boxes and barrels were split open, their contents spilled everywhere. Clothes and household items were scattered across the rocks. And underneath the overturned wagon, he could see a flash of blue fabric. The crying was coming from there. Thomas stood there for a moment, breathing hard, taking in the scene. Then he heard the woman's voice, weak and desperate. "Please," she was saying, "please, someone help me." And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas McCarthy had something to do that mattered. Thomas dropped his bag and ran toward the overturned wagon. The woman's cries were getting weaker, and he could hear the fear in her voice. As he got closer, he could see her more clearly. She was trapped under the heavy wooden side of the wagon, her blue dress torn and dirty. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and was scattered around her face. "Ma'am," Thomas called out as he approached. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I'm going to help you." The woman looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with a pretty face that was now streaked with tears and dirt. But Thomas could see she wasn't crying because she was hurt. There was something deeper in her eyes, something that went beyond physical pain. "Please," she whispered, "please help me. I can't move it." Thomas knelt down beside the wagon and put his hands on the wooden frame. It was heavy, much heavier than he expected. The whole thing had flipped over, probably when the wagon hit a rock or went into a hole. He could see that the woman wasn't badly injured, but she was pinned down by the weight of it. "I'm going to lift this up," Thomas said, trying to sound calm and confident. "When I do, you need to slide out from under it. Can you do that?" The woman nodded, wiping tears from her eyes with a dirty hand. Thomas positioned himself and took a deep breath. He hadn't done any real physical work in months, and his body felt weak. But something about this situation gave him strength he didn't know he still had. With a grunt of effort, Thomas lifted the wagon frame. His muscles screamed in protest, and he could feel his hands shaking from the strain. But he held it up long, enough for the woman to scramble out from underneath. "Okay," he gasped, letting the wagon frame drop back down with a crash. "You're free." The woman sat on the ground for a moment, breathing heavily. Then she looked around at the scattered remains of her belongings, and her face crumpled. She started crying again, but these weren't tears of fear anymore. These were tears of complete despair. Thomas didn't know what to do. He'd never been good with crying women, even when he was sober and had his life together. But something about this woman's sadness touched something deep inside him. He sat down on a rock nearby and waited for her to speak. "I'm sorry," she finally sighed, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "I'm so sorry. You must think I'm foolish, crying like this when I'm not even hurt." "No, ma'am," Thomas said quietly. "I don't think you're foolish at all. Sometimes crying is the only thing that makes sense." The woman looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such understanding from a stranger. Especially not from a stranger who looked like Thomas, with his ragged clothes and unkempt appearance. "My name is Eleanor," she said after a moment. "Eleanor Hartwell. And I was traveling to California." "I'm Thomas," he replied. "Thomas McCarthy." "What happened?" "Here? How did your wagon flip over?" Eleanor looked around at the wreckage and shook her head. "I don't really know. I was driving alone, and I think one of the wheels hit a rock. The next thing I knew, everything was turning over and over. I thought I was going to die." "You were driving alone?" Thomas asked. That was unusual. Most women didn't travel alone, especially not on dangerous trails like this one. Eleanor's face fell again. "Yes, my husband died 6 months ago. Tuberculosis. He was only 28 years old." Her voice broke on the last words. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. He knew what it was like to lose everything, but he'd never lost someone he loved to death. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. His name was Robert. "We were married for only 3 years, but they were the best years of my life. We had so many plans, so many dreams." She gestured weakly at the scattered belongings around them. "All of this was supposed to be our new start. Robert bought land in California before he got sick. A little piece of property in the Central Valley where we were going to build a farm. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would go there anyway. He said it would be our dream, even if he couldn't be there to see it." Thomas looked around at the broken boxes and scattered items. There were clothes everywhere, pots and pans, books, and what looked like farming tools. It was clear that Eleanor had been carrying everything she owned in this wagon. "But now," Eleanor continued, her voice getting higher and more desperate, "now it's all ruined. Everything's broken or scattered. And the worst part is," she started crying again, harder. This time, "What's the worst part?" Thomas asked gently. "There was a wooden box," Eleanor sobbed. "A small wooden box that Robert made for me. It had all his letters in it. Every letter he ever wrote to me when he was away on business. And it had the deed to the land in California. The papers that prove we own it. Without those papers, I have nothing. Nothing at all." Thomas looked around at the scattered debris. He could see broken pieces of wood that might have been from a box, but no intact container. Where was the box when the wagon flipped? "It was in the back, with the other important things, but I can't find it anywhere. I've been looking for an hour before you came, and I can't find it. The papers must be scattered to the wind by now." Thomas stood up and started walking around the wreckage. He could see that the wagon had tumbled quite a ways before it stopped. Items were scattered over a wide area, some of them caught in bush or wedged between rocks. "We'll find it," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Or at least we'll find the papers. They might be scattered, but they're probably still around here somewhere." Eleanor looked up at him with hope in her eyes. "You'll help me look?" Thomas nodded. "Of course. But first, let me ask you something. Do you have any family? Anyone who's expecting you in California?" Eleanor's face fell again. "No, Robert was all I had. His family never liked me, and my parents died when I was young. I was raised by my aunt, but she passed away last year. That's why I'm going to California. There's nowhere else for me to go." The desperation in her voice was something Thomas recognized. It was the same feeling he'd been carrying for 3 years. The feeling of being completely alone in the world, with no one who cared whether you lived or died. "How much money do you have?" Thomas asked. Eleanor looked embarrassed. "Not much. Maybe $20. I spent most of what I had on supplies for the trip. I was planning to sell some of my things when I got to California to help me get started." Thomas looked around at the broken and scattered belongings. Most of them were damaged beyond repair. Eleanor's situation was even worse than his own. At least he could walk away from his problems. She was stranded here with almost nothing. "The nearest town is Deer Lodge," Thomas said. "It's about a day's walk from here. But we need to find those papers first." Eleanor nodded eagerly. "Yes, without the deed, I have no way to prove the land is mine. Robert paid for it fair and square, but if I can't prove ownership, then someone else could claim it," Thomas finished. "Exactly. And then I'd have nothing. No home, no money, no family. I'd be completely lost." Thomas looked at this woman, this stranger who had appeared in his life just when he thought he had nothing left to give. She was in a worse situation than he was, but she still had hope. She still had a dream, even if it seemed impossible now. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas felt something stirring inside him that he'd almost forgotten existed. It was the feeling of being needed, of having a purpose, of mattering too. "We'll find those papers," he said firmly, "and then we'll figure out how to get you to California." Eleanor looked at him with tears in her eyes, but for the first time since he'd found her, they weren't tears of despair. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me?" "You don't even know me." Thomas thought about that question. Why was he helping her? He had his own problems, his own empty life to worry about. But looking at Eleanor, seeing her struggle and her hope, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be the man he used to be. Thomas rolled up his sleeves and started searching through the scattered belongings. The morning sun was getting warmer, and he could feel sweat on his forehead as he moved broken boxes and torn fabric. Eleanor worked beside him, her dress dirty and torn, but her movements were quick and determined. "There," Eleanor said, pointing to a piece of carved wood stuck between 2 rocks. "That looks like part of my box." Thomas climbed over the rocks and pulled out a piece of polished walnut wood. It was beautifully carved with small flowers around the edges. "Your husband made this?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, taking the piece gently in her hands. "Robert was good with his hands. He made this for our first anniversary." Her voice was soft, but Thomas could hear the pain in it. They kept searching. Thomas found more pieces of the broken box scattered in different directions. The wood had split apart when the wagon crashed, but the pieces were still beautiful. He could see that Robert had put a lot of love into making it. "Here," Thomas called out. He was crouched behind a large bush, and he could see something white caught in the branches. "I think I found some papers." Eleanor rushed over, her skirts catching on the thorny bush. Thomas carefully pulled out several folded papers. Some were torn and all of them were dirty, but they were still readable. "These are Robert's letters," Eleanor whispered, taking them carefully. Her hands were shaking as she unfolded one of them. "This is the last letter he wrote me before he got sick." She held it close to her chest for a moment, then looked up at Thomas with tears in her eyes. "Thank you." But they still hadn't found the most important thing, the deed to the California. Land was still missing. They searched for 2 more hours. Thomas climbed into ravines and looked under every rock and bush. Eleanor checked through every piece of scattered belongings twice, but the deed was nowhere to be found. "Maybe it blew away," Eleanor said, sitting down on a rock. She looked exhausted and defeated. "Maybe the wind took it, and it's miles from here by now." Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead and looked around. The wind was picking up, and he could see dust and small pieces of paper blowing across the landscape. If the deed had been loose when the wagon crashed, it could be anywhere by now. We'll keep looking, he said. But maybe we should take a break first. You need some water. Thomas had found Eleanor's water barrel, which was cracked but still had some water in it. He gave her his tin cup filled with water, and she drank it gratefully. I don't understand why you're helping me, Eleanor said, looking at Thomas with curious eyes. Most men would have walked away by now. Thomas sat down on another rock and thought about her question. Why was he helping her? 3 days ago, he would have walked past this accident without stopping. He would have told himself it wasn't his problem. I guess I needed something to do, he said finally. I've been walking these roads for 3 years with no purpose at all. At least now I have a reason to get up in the morning. Eleanor studied his face. What happened to you? How did you end up wandering these roads? Thomas had never told anyone his full story before, but something about Eleanor made him want to be honest. Maybe it was because she'd been so open about her own pain. I used to work on the railroad, he said slowly. I was good at it too. But I started drinking and I couldn't stop. I lost my job. My family won't talk to me, and I've been drifting ever since. Have you tried to stop drinking? Eleanor asked gently. Thomas looked down his hands. Many times. But every time I tried, I'd start thinking about how I'd ruin everything, and the drinking seemed like the only way to make the thoughts stop. When was the last time you had a drink? Eleanor asked. Thomas thought about it. 3 days ago. I think I ran out of money, and I've been too focused on walking to think about it much. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Robert tried to quit smoking his pipe many times. He said the hardest part wasn't the wanting. It was filling up the empty time where he used to smoke. Thomas nodded. That made sense to him. I never thought about it that way, but you're right. When you're not drinking, you have to face all the quiet moments where you remember how empty your life is. Maybe that's why helping me feels good to you, Eleanor said. It's filling up some of that empty time with something that matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them thinking. The sun was getting higher, and Thomas knew. They needed to make a decision soon about what to do next. Eleanor, he said finally, even if we find the deed, how are you planning to get to California? Your wagon is destroyed, and you don't have much money. Eleanor's face fell. I don't know. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I was so focused on finding the papers that I didn't think about what comes next. Thomas stood up and walked around the wreckage again. The wagon can't be fixed, but some of your things are still usable. We could sell what we can in Deer Lodge and see about getting you on a stagecoach. A stagecoach ticket to California will cost more money than I have, Eleanor said. And besides, I'd still need money to live on when I got there. Thomas rubbed his chin, thinking. He had an idea, but he wasn't sure if Eleanor would accept. What if you didn't travel alone? He asked carefully. Eleanor looked at him with surprise. What do you mean? I mean, what if I came with you? We could travel together, help each other out. I don't have anything keeping me here, and you need someone to help you get there safely. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. Thomas, you barely know me. Why would you want to travel hundreds of miles with a stranger? Thomas sat back down and looked directly at her. Because for the first time in 3 years, I feel like I have a purpose. Helping you, protecting you, making sure you get to your land safely. It makes me feel like I'm worth something again. But what would you do in California? Eleanor asked. I don't even know if there's really a farm there, or if it's just empty. Land. Then we'll build a farm, Thomas said simply. I'm good with my hands when I'm sober. I know how to work hard. And you need someone to help you get started. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, thinking. Thomas could see her weighing the idea in her mind. It was a big decision. Traveling with a man she'd just met, trusting him with her safety and her future. What would people think? she asked finally. A widow traveling with a man who isn't. Her husband. We tell people we're business partners, Thomas said, which would be true. You need help building your farm, and I need honest work and a place to belong. Eleanor looked around at the scattered remains of her old life, then back. At Thomas. You really think we could make it work? Two strangers starting over together? I think, Thomas said slowly, that sometimes strangers make the best partners. We don't have any old grudges or hurt feelings to get in the way. We both know what it's like to lose everything, and we both want a chance to build something better. Eleanor was quiet again, but Thomas could see something changing in her expression. The hopelessness was fading, replaced by something that looked like determination. There's something else, Thomas said. I haven't had a drink in 3 days, and I haven't even wanted one. Being busy helping you, having something important to focus on, it's the first time I felt like I could really quit for good. Eleanor looked at him with new understanding. You think having a purpose would help you stay sober. I think having someone who depends on me would give me a reason to stay sober, Thomas said. And having honest work to do every day will keep my hands and mind busy. Eleanor stood up and walked to the edge of the trail, looking out at the mountains in the distance. California was out there somewhere beyond those peaks. Her future, whatever it might be. If we did this, she said without turning around, it would have to be a real partnership. Equal partners. I won't be treated like a helpless woman who needs a man to take care of her. I wouldn't want it any other way, Thomas said. You're stronger than you think, Eleanor. Anyone who would travel alone to start over in a new place has more courage than most people. Eleanor turned back to face him. And if you started drinking again, Thomas thought about that seriously. Then you'd have every right to leave me behind and continue on your own. But I don't think I will. For the first time in years, I have something to lose that I actually care about. Eleanor walked back over to him and held out her hand. Partners? She asked. Thomas shook her hand, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Partners. He agreed. Now let's find that deed and get started on our new life. They never did find the deed that first day. After searching until the sun started to set, Thomas and Eleanor had to accept that the papers might be gone forever. But something had changed between them during those hours of working together. They had become a team. We'll figure it out, Thomas said as they made camp that night. He gathered wood for a fire while Eleanor sorted through the few belongings that could be saved. Even without the papers, we know where the land is. We'll find a way to prove it belongs to you. Eleanor looked at him across the small fire. You really mean that, don't you? You're really willing to come with me to California? Thomas nodded. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. They spent that night sharing stories around the fire. Eleanor told Thomas about her life with Robert, about their dreams and plans. Thomas found himself talking about his childhood, about the man he used to be before the drinking took over. For the first time in years, he didn't feel ashamed of his past. He felt like he was talking to someone who understood. The next morning, they loaded what they could carry into Thomas's old bag and started walking toward Deer Lodge. It was slow going. Eleanor wasn't used to walking long distances, and her shoes weren't made for rough trails. But she never complained, and Thomas found himself admiring her determination. Tell me about this land in California, Thomas said as they walked. What? Did Robert tell you about it? Eleanor's face brightened. He said it was in the Central Valley, near a small town called Riverside. 20 acres of good soil, with a creek running through it. Perfect for farming. He showed me pictures from the land office. What kind of farming were you planning to do? Thomas asked. Robert wanted to grow wheat and corn. Maybe some vegetables to sell in town. He said the soil was rich and the climate was perfect for growing almost anything. Thomas felt a spark of excitement. He'd worked on farms as a boy, before. His family moved to the city. He knew how to plant crops, how to build fences, how to care for animals. I could help with that, he said. I know farming. Over the next 3 days of walking to Deer Lodge, they planned their future together. Thomas would handle the heavy work, clearing land, building structures, planting crops. Eleanor would manage the household, tend a vegetable garden, and handle the business side of selling their produce. They would split any profits equally. It won't be easy, Eleanor warned. We'll be starting with almost nothing. I'm used to having nothing, Thomas replied. The difference is, now I have something to work toward. When they reached Deer Lodge, Thomas was surprised by how different he felt. 3 days of steady work and purpose had changed something inside him. He stood up straighter. He looked people in the eye when he spoke. Eleanor noticed a change too. You look like a different person, she told him as they walked into town. Thomas caught sight of himself in a store window and was shocked. She was right. He still looked rough and worn, but there was something different in his posture, in his expression. He looked like a man with a purpose again. They sold what they could have, Eleanor's belongings, and bought supplies for the journey west. Thomas used some of his few remaining coins to buy a razor and gave himself a proper shave. Eleanor mended his clothes and bought him a new shirt. They were still poor, but they looked respectable. The stagecoach to California was expensive, but they had just enough money for 2 tickets if they were careful. The driver looked skeptical when they said they were business partners, but their story held up under questioning. The journey west took 2 weeks. Thomas had never traveled so far from home, and every mile took him further from his old life of wandering and drinking. At night, when the stagecoach stopped at way stations, he and Eleanor would sit together and plan their fun. Thomas found that the constant planning and conversation kept his mind off drinking. Eleanor was smart and practical, full of ideas about how to make their farm successful. Talking with her made him feel useful in a way he hadn't felt in years. What will we do if someone else is living on the land? Eleanor asked one night. We'll figure it out when we get there, Thomas said. But I have a feeling it's going to work out. Things have been going too well for them to fall apart now. Eleanor smiled. You sound like an optimist. I wouldn't have guessed that about you. When we first met, Thomas thought about that. She was right. Somewhere during their journey, he'd started believing that good things were possible. You did that, he told her. You made me believe in hope again. When they finally reached California, Thomas was amazed by the landscape. Rolling hills covered in golden grass, mountains in the distance, and everywhere the sense of space and possibility. This was a place where a person could start over, where the past didn't have to define the future. They found the town of Riverside easily enough. It was smaller than Thomas had expected, just a few dozen buildings clustered around a main street. But it was growing. New settlers were arriving every week, and there was plenty of work for anyone willing to do it. The land office was their first stop. Thomas let Eleanor do the talking, but he stood beside her, ready to support whatever story she needed to tell. I'm looking for information about property owned by Robert Hartwell, Eleanor said to the clerk. 20 acres in the Central Valley. The clerk checked his records. Hartwell. Yes, here it is. 20 acres, purchased 18 months ago, paid in full. But I'll need to see the deed to transfer ownership. Eleanor's face fell. The deed was lost in an accident. Is there any other way to prove ownership? The clerk looked sympathetic but shook his head. I'm sorry, ma'am. Without the deed, there's no way to prove the land belongs to you. For all I know, you could be anyone claiming someone else's property. Thomas felt his heart sink, but Eleanor wasn't giving up. What if I could prove I was Robert's wife? She asked. I have our marriage certificate. The clerk examined the document carefully. This proves you were married, but it doesn't prove he owned the land. Anyone could have told you about a property purchase. Thomas had an idea. What if we could find someone who knew Robert? Someone who could vouch for Eleanor? The clerk considered this. Well, if you could find the man who sold Robert the land, he might remember the transaction. His name is William Davies. He has a ranch about 10 miles east of here. They found William Davies working in his barn, repairing harness leather. He was a weather-beaten man in his 50s with kind eyes and callous hands. Robert Hartwell? He said when Eleanor introduced herself. Of course I remember Robert. Nice young man, very excited about starting a farm. He talked about his wife constantly. He looked at Eleanor carefully. You be Eleanor, then. He showed me your photograph. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Yes, that's me, but we lost the deed to the land in an accident. The land office won't recognize our ownership without it. William thought for a moment. I remember that transaction well. Robert paid me in cash all 20s and 10s. Said he'd been saving for 2 years. We signed the papers right here in my kitchen, and I gave him coffee with cream. He said you made the best coffee he'd ever tasted. Eleanor smiled through her tears. He always said that. William nodded decisively. I'll go to the land office with you. I remember every detail of that sale. Between my testimony and your marriage certificate, that should be enough to establish ownership. It was. The next day, Eleanor officially owned 20 acres of California farmland. Thomas stood beside her as she signed the new papers, feeling prouder than he'd felt in years. When they finally saw the land, Thomas knew they'd found home. It was everything Robert had promised: rich soil, plenty of water, and endless possibilities. There was no house yet, just empty land waiting for them to build their dreams on it. It's perfect, Eleanor whispered. Thomas looked at the woman who had changed his life and the land that would be their future. For the first time in years, he could see a clear path ahead. Not an easy path, but a meaningful one. Yes, he said. It really is. 2 years had passed since that morning when Thomas found Eleanor trapped under her overturned wagon. As he stood on the front porch of their small farmhouse, watching the sun rise over their wheat fields, Thomas could barely recognize the man he used to be. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just 4 rooms built from local timber, with a stone chimney that Thomas had constructed himself. But it was solid and warm, and it was theirs. More importantly, it was filled with life and purpose in a way Thomas had never experienced before. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Thomas and stood beside him, looking out at their land. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a practical blue dress that she'd sewn herself. She looked content in a way that reminded Thomas why he'd fallen in love with her. They'd been married for 8 months now. It had taken them over a year of working together before Thomas had worked up the courage to ask her. He'd been terrified that she'd say no, that she still thought of him as just a drifter who'd helped her out of a bad situation. I've been thinking about you as more than a partner for months, Eleanor had told him when he finally asked. I was just waiting for you to realize it too. Their wedding had been simple. Just the 2 of them, the preacher from town, and William Davies as their witness. Eleanor had worn her mother's dress, which she carefully preserved through all her travels. Thomas had bought his first new suit in 5 years. It wasn't fancy, but it was the happiest day of either of their lives. Now, as they stood together watching their crops grow in the early morning light, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction that he'd never known was possible. The wheat was coming in well this year. Their vegetable garden was producing more than they could eat. They had 3 cows, a dozen chickens, and a horse that Thomas had trained himself. The Hendersons should be here around noon, Eleanor said, sipping her coffee. Mrs. Henderson said they're bringing their 2 boys. Thomas nodded. The Hendersons were a family who'd lost everything in a fire back in Kansas. They'd heard about Thomas and Eleanor's farm through word of mouth, the way most people found them. These days, families who were down on their luck, men who'd lost their way, women who needed a safe place to stay while they figured out their next step. It had started by accident. About 6 months after they'd gotten the farm running, a man named Pete had shown up at their door. He was thin and desperate, looking for work and a place to sleep. Thomas had seen something familiar in the man's eyes, the same lost look he'd carried for 3 years. We can give you work for a few weeks, Thomas had told him. Help us bring in the harvest, and we'll give you meals and a place in the barn. Pete had worked harder than Thomas expected. During the evenings, as they sat around the dinner table, Pete had told them his story. He'd lost his job at a lumber mill, spent all his money on drinking, and ended up wandering just like Thomas used to do. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life," Pete had said one night. "I feel like I'm just taking up space in the world." Thomas had looked across the table at Eleanor, and they both understood. This man needed more than work. He needed hope. They'd spent the next 2 weeks not just giving Pete work, but helping him figure out what he wanted to do next. Eleanor had taught him to read better. Thomas had shown him farming techniques that he could use if he decided to start his own place. Most importantly, they treated him like family. When Pete left, he was a different man. He had a plan, money saved up, and most importantly, he had confidence in himself again. 2 months later, they'd gotten a letter from him. He'd found steady work at a ranch in Oregon and was saving money to bring his wife and children west. Word had spread after that. People in difficult situations started showing up at their door. Some stayed for a few days, some for a few weeks. Thomas and Eleanor never turned anyone away who was genuinely trying to improve their situation. "Remember when we thought 20 acres was a lot of land?" Eleanor said with a smile. "Now it barely seems big enough for everyone who needs help." Thomas laughed. It was true. Their little farm had become something neither of them had planned. They still grew crops and raised animals, but their real work had become helping other people find their way. The kitchen table that Thomas had built their first winter now regularly seated 8 or 10 people. Eleanor had become an expert at stretching meals to feed whoever showed up hungry. Thomas had built a second barn and was planning a third. "I've been thinking," Thomas said carefully, "maybe we should make this official." Eleanor looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I mean maybe we should stop pretending this is just a farm. Maybe we should call it what it really is, a place where people can come to get back on their feet." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking, "That's a big step. Right now, we help people because we want to. If we make it official, people might expect us to solve problems we can't solve." Thomas nodded. "I know, but I also think we could help more people if we were organized about it. We could partner with the churches in town, maybe get some donations to help people who need clothes or tools." They've been having this conversation on and off for months. Thomas felt called to expand what they were doing, but he didn't want to push Eleanor into something she wasn't ready for. "What made you think about it again?" Eleanor asked. Thomas pointed toward the road, where a small cloud of dust indicated someone was approaching. "Because every week more people show up than the week before. And every time I see someone who reminds me of myself 3 years ago, I think about how different my life would be if you hadn't given me a chance to be useful." Eleanor reached over and took his hand. "You gave yourself that chance, Thomas. I just happened to be there when you were ready to take it." The approaching wagon came into view. It was loaded with furniture and belongings, clearly a family making a big move. As it got closer, Thomas could see a man and woman in the front seat with 3 children visible in the back. "Looks like the Hendersons brought more than just 2 boys," Eleanor observed. Thomas smiled. "Good thing I built that extra room last month." As the wagon pulled into their yard, Thomas and Eleanor walked out to greet the new arrivals. The man driving looked tired and worried, but hopeful. The woman beside him was holding a baby, and Thomas could see the relief in her eyes as she looked at their neat, prosperous farm. "Are you Thomas McCarthy?" the man asked as he climbed down. "From the wagon, I am," Thomas replied. "And this is my wife, Eleanor. You must be the Henderson family." "Yes, sir," the man said, removing his hat. "I'm James Henderson, and this is my wife, Mary. These are our children, Daniel, Samuel, and little Rebecca." The 2 boys, who looked to be about 8 and 10 years old, peered shyly from behind their father. The baby in Mary's arms was fussing, and Eleanor immediately stepped forward. "Let me help you with that little one." Eleanor said gently. "She's probably tired from the journey." As Eleanor took the baby and began bouncing her gently, Thomas saw the same transformation in Mary Henderson's face that he'd seen dozens of times before. The tension started to leave her shoulders. The worry lines around her eyes softened slightly. "We heard about your place from Pastor Williams back in Missouri," James said. "He said you folks help families who are trying to start over." "That's right," Thomas said. "What's your situation?" James looked embarrassed. "We lost our farm to the bank. Bad crops 2 years running, and we couldn't keep up with the payments. We've got a little money saved, and I'm a good worker. We're not looking for charity. We just need a place to stay while we figure out our next step." Thomas nodded. He'd heard similar stories many times. "Well, let's get your wagon unloaded and get you settled in. We can talk about the details after you've had a chance to rest and eat." As they worked together to unload the Hendersons' belongings, Thomas felt the familiar sense of satisfaction that came from helping someone in need. But it was more than that. Watching Eleanor comfort the baby, seeing the hope return to James and Mary's faces, observing the two boys start to explore their new surroundings with curiosity instead of fear, it all reminded Thomas of why he got up every morning now. This was his purpose. Not just the farming, though he loved working the land. Not just being married to Eleanor, though that brought him more joy than he'd ever thought possible. His real purpose was being someone that people in trouble could count on. Being the kind of man who didn't walk past when someone needed help. That evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Thomas looked at the faces gathered there. Eleanor, glowing with the satisfaction of a good meal shared. The Henderson family relaxed for the first time in months. 2 other men who were working temporarily on the farm while they saved money for their own fresh starts. 3 years ago, Thomas had been a man with no purpose, walking empty roads with nowhere to go. Tonight, he was surrounded by people who depended on him in a home he built with his own hands. Living a life that mattered. Eleanor caught his eye across the table and smiled. She knew what he was thinking. She was thinking the same thing. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to be needed. And sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the courage to let yourself need someone else. Thomas had found both. And in finding them, he'd found himself.